and welcome back to Dev Game Club, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers talk about games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. I'm Brett Duval, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who puts the Dur in Thexder, the Orc in Dark Forces, and the Doe in Republic Commando.
Tim Longo. Wow, that is, you outdid yourself on that one. Sheesh.
Thank you very much. There's a little tease in there, a little tease with a couple
little
games.
Darrenisms there.
Yeah, so I thought I'd...
Thexder threw me. I remember playing that as a kid, but I noticed in his credits, which I am about to introduce, Thexder credit there for programming. So yeah, I'm excited to introduce Daron Stinnett, project lead for Dark Forces, who started programming for games in the 80s and joined Spectrum Holobyte, kind of legendary company back in 90, working on the FalCon 3.0 series. And then in 93, he joined LucasArts and had many roles there, including lead programmer and project lead on Dark Forces, executive producer on various things. But after Dark Forces, went on to Outlaws, where Brett and I worked after that, worked for him on Starfighter and Jedi Starfighter and Republic Commando, where he was production executive producer for those and project lead on Starfighter and director, and then went into executive producer at LucasArts, where he worked on Star Wars Episode 3 as well as Republic Commando, and then left LucasArts eventually, joined Perpetual Entertainment initially, working on MMOs, Star Trek Online, as well as Gods and Heroes, Rome Rising, and then was a co-founder of PlayGrid, which was a gaming service, and now works in technology all over the place and for various companies. Welcome to the podcast, Daron. We are excited to have you, our old boss.
Well, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it was a real treat to play Dark Forces for the podcast. We thought because Solo was the Han Solo movie was out, it would be a good kind of we try to combine the games we're playing with some event that's happening either in games or in media, and so it was kind of a nice correlation there. Of course, Kyle Katarn being gaming's first Han Solo, I would say, in a cool way. So I mean, one of the things we obviously like to start with is sort of a little bit of history about you and how you got into gaming in general for the audience, and then maybe lead into LucasArts and how Dark Forces started. But how did you get into everything?
Let's see. So I started out in high school. I was actually planning on becoming an architect and found computers in the computer lab and managed to convince my architecture teacher that I could build a computer-aided design program, which at that time didn't even exist. It was just, hey, I bet we could make houses on computers. And he was like, sure. And of course, that was an impossible task in those days. So what I did is I made games instead.
You're ahead of your time.
What every red-blooded American teenager does, right? Is wants to play games. So that's what I did, and so but fortunately that worked out pretty well, and found myself pretty quickly. Somebody found their way to us. I think it was through, if anybody remembers, Radio Shack. Someone came in who was a publisher of video games and was talking to someone at Radio Shack, and he knew us, me and a friend of mine who were making these games together, and so I made the connection, and so he was like, hey, why don't you do what you're doing and have fun, and I'll sell them and pay you for it. And we're like, oh, that sounds like a great idea. So
I've never heard this story before. Radio Shack? Are you serious?
Yeah,
hilarious.
Yeah, literally, like some sales agent at Radio Shack, connected us together with our first publisher.
That is great. So where was that? Was that in Seattle at the time, or?
Yeah, I was up in Seattle.
Okay. Yeah.
And I had a friend of mine, Rick Lamont, who was literally my next door neighbor. And we were making games together anyway. And so, so we just started doing it for money and, bought our first cars with it.
Wow.
That's amazing.
Okay. And what
it was hard to
car? Hold on. It's important. What kind of car did you buy?
That is important because it was an exceedingly cool Chevrolet Vega, and it was powder blue with a white interior.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah.
So it was hard to tell from the credits on Moby Games that I was referencing. What was the first game? What were the first couple games there what fueled the Vega?
It was Space Race.
Okay.
It was our very first game, it was basically a ripoff. It was made for the Tandy color computer, and it was a ripoff of Omega Race, which was an arcade game at the time. It was the one where you'd fly around, you'd fly sort of like around in, it was an evolution of asteroids.
Right.
Vector graphics, and you'd fly around and bounce off, had more of a confined square environment, and you'd just get, waves and waves of enemies and have to shoot them all down. And it was loads of mindless fun.
Yeah, that sounds great. I don't think I've ever. I bet that's still, you can find that on some sort of virtual PC on the internet, and if I can track it down, I'll put it in the show notes so people can check it out.
Oh, you totally can. I've found it.
You can?
It's out there. Oh yeah,
awesome! I will track it down.
My source code running and everything.
Thexder was the earliest I could think of games that I knew you had worked on, and I knew Tim was going to be doing the research, so I left it to him. That is awesome.
So what was the step from there to Spectrum? What was that like?
Well, so we were, basically we're doing this in high school, so it was sort of something we did after school and read code and built this game, and I worked on a couple of other similar kind of things. They were kind of done in this very ad hoc way. And when I got out of high school, I decided that I was going to pursue games and a coding career right there. And the university at the time just had nothing to offer me in that arena. It was great if you wanted to go and learn Fortran or COBOL and program on a VAX or something like that. But, making high performance games on personal computers just wasn't a thing then that you could go to school for. So, so coming out of high school, I needed regular income so I could afford a place to live and pay for car insurance and all that stuff you got to do. And so, Synergistic Software was right there in my hometown. So they were a game maker. So I went down there, interviewed with them, and got a job. And that was went from kind of self-publishing, or I'm not going to say self-publishing, but developing on the side and giving a game to a publisher and seeing if they would pay me some money in return, to having a regular full-time job as a game developer, working for Synergistic. And that's where I really got into coding and making games, and we made a bunch of games for the PC and for the Commodore 64 and Apple II. So yeah, I worked several years there, basically just as a game designer and coder.
And is that where Thexder came in at that point, or was that?
Yeah, I think it was.
I forget.
If I remember. Yeah, it was. Well, it was
because that was published by Sierra, right?
Yeah, I left Synergistic Software and started contracting, but I think I was contracting with Synergistic after that, sort of went independent. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like, I can't remember for sure, it's been a long time ago, but I feel like maybe that contract came from Sierra Online through Synergistic Software and then to me as their contractor.
Okay.
And I worked on the Apple II version of that.
Okay, yeah, because Sierra published it, I think, stateside. I believe that's how.
Yeah, it was a Japanese game.
Yeah. I love that game back then. We probably talked about it at some point, but I totally forgot that you were working on one of the ports of that. That's cool. And then did you, because Spectrum Holobyte was over on the East Coast, right? Was that, do I have that right?
No, they were here in
Microprose was on the East Coast.
Okay, right. I have those two mixed up.
When it merged, yeah.
Right.
And I think they merged, eventually. But they were here. I'm in San Francisco now, and Spectrum Holobyte was located in Alameda, which is over near Oakland.
Right.
And it was actually why I moved to the San Francisco area, was to join Spectrum Holobyte.
Got it. And you were, I feel like I remember you talking about FalCon a fair amount, and were you were a flight sim, or was it because flight sims, we talked about this a little bit, Brett and I, when we played TIE Fighter for the podcast, but flight sims were kind of the cutting edge genre around that time. Was that why you moved over to FalCon to kind of get into the cutting edge stuff, or were you a flight buff? What was the interest there getting over to that company, or was it just the job that popped up?
It was actually not at all. I had played, what was it? What was the game that came before?
There was Chuck Yeager.
Yeager, yeah. I played a lot of Chuck Yeager.
Yeah, that was
a big fan.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, big fan of that game. And so, and I think it was a big inspiration for X-Wing. So I enjoyed that, but I actually joined Spectrum Holobyte. I don't remember how I got in touch with that company, but I joined them because they wanted to start doing console games. So I joined them to do Nintendo games for Spectrum Holobyte, and I was actually working with just basically a new group at Spectrum and doing nothing like flight simulators. It was, more like, side scroller, top down scroller kind of games, irreverent, funny, cool stuff. But I was there doing that, and I feel like I was there for maybe 6 months or so working on console games, and meanwhile, the bulk of the company was focused on FalCon 3, and they were really struggling to ship that game. And so they really didn't have anybody managing the project. It was basically just a group of engineers and some artists, and they were trying to get this thing, and it was a gargantuan project, a big PC project, and strangely, I didn't know anything about PC development. I'd never made a flight simulator. In fact, I'd never really managed a team before. But I saw what was happening, and it was existential for the company, because the company needed to ship this game in order to survive. And so I went to the CEO of the company and I said, "Hey, nobody's running this team. I think it would run a lot better if somebody did. And I'm happy to do that." And he said, "Great, you're it." And that was when I overnight went from being a console programmer, never having managed anybody, to managing a pretty large team developing FalCon. And I had no idea what I was doing, but I didn't know that I didn't know what I was doing. And so, so I just jumped in, and I loved every minute of it. It was a lot of fun.
Wow, I don't think this is a treat.
Yeah, I've never heard this. Yeah, I've never heard this story either.
My mouth is a gape right now, and it's like, what is happening?
And that's really indicative of how the industry was at that time, right? Is just some new job needs doing, and the industry grows and changes. It was just kind of how things happened back then.
Exactly. Nobody really knew what they were doing. Right. Yeah. So if you could just put your hand up and say, "I'll do it," and you would, by definition, be doing it better than anyone had ever done it before.
Right. Yeah. We'll touch on early level design when we get to Dark Forces for sure, and I think that same topic will come up as far as like cutting edge, like what did it mean for a discipline to be created? But continue on. So you're running. I mean, I remember FalCon 3.0. That was their big deal. I mean, that was a huge thing when it came out, and of course, the manual was huge as well.
Yeah, it was a brick. I really enjoyed it. I would play and play and play that game just for fun. But I'm testing as well. We're shipping it and launching it, so I was like the lead, team lead and lead tester. Honestly, in those days was most of what being team lead was about, and I played it all hours of the night. I really enjoyed it. I got into it too because once we launched it, it had an incredible community of people. It was a multiplayer game, which just blows my mind.
Yeah,
that
totally.
was a multiplayer game in those days because we were using. I remember like telling people like you gotta upgrade to a 600 baud modem. The 300 baud's just not going to cut it. And so those were really early days of multiplayer games, but people loved it, and they would go out and buy equipment, hardware and cockpits and flight sticks, and just all the paraphernalia, with the flight simulation game, and the military loved it as well. I remember we had stuff going on with the Air Force and with the Army around flight simulator training. And so I got to get involved in that. We did a conference down in Vegas. We came up with this idea of let's have something called FalCon down in Vegas. And so we put together a Falcon convention, which I don't know, I have to look it up. It might be one of the first gaming conventions ever.
Yeah.
It very well may be the very first one. I don't know. But we put it in, and people came from all over the country to Vegas and met up, and we had it was more of a, everybody get together and get to know each other because we all knew each other flying. We knew each other by our call signs. Yeah. Everybody wanted to meet each other in person. So we met and some restaurant down there and on the Strip. And then we had a big giant LAN party for a couple days, basically.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was early days for sure. Yeah, that community, I remember that community. I remember I don't remember how old I was exactly around that time, but I mean, wanting to be a part of that community, but never being great enough at the game to feel like I could hold my own. But reading about it, and in the magazines and stuff, that was definitely cool. I didn't know about FalCon though. That's also hilarious. Could have been one of the first. Could have been one of the first. Yeah.
I love that it was in Vegas. I don't know something about.
And then
all conventions happen in Vegas.
Yeah, exactly. Especially in those. Yeah, but then Alameda's not far from. Is it Moffett Field? I mean, there's some pretty. I feel like there's a lot of companies down there. I don't know if Boeing has anything down there, but it seemed like a good location for Falcon to be made. So then what happened? Sure. What happened with LucasArts? Like, how did that pop up? And what was the next step?
So we had at Spectrum Holobyte, we had all the stuff for flight simulator cockpits and stuff, and so we had this cockpit all decked out with throttle and stick and big stereo system in it, and you got in this thing and really felt like you're flying an F-16. And I remember when X-Wing came out, and I went straight to the game store and bought a copy and brought it back and loaded it up in the PC in our cockpit and sat down and just mind blown. It was just sitting in a cockpit, and here I was. The text scroll comes up, and it's blaring the music, which gets me all jazzed up about Star Wars again, which I hadn't thought about in a long time. This was in early 93, and so I hadn't thought about Star Wars in years. And then having the text scroll come up and that music, and the next thing I know, I'm flying an X-Wing, sitting in a cockpit with stick and throttle, and this booming, great sound system and vibration in the seat. I was so blown away that, I don't know, for me, it was one thing to have a flight simulator that was an approximation of a real world thing, an F-16 fighter. right? Which is a lower fidelity, simulation of an F-16 of a real world thing, to going to this thing that to me just felt like this very high fidelity simulation of something that actually didn't exist in the real world, and the fact that I could feel like I was an X-Wing fighter pilot, doing something that just didn't exist in the real world. And to me, it actually almost felt more real because I didn't have anything to compare it to in the real world. It just blew my mind. And so at that moment on, I knew that I had to make Star Wars games. I had to make 3D, immersive Star Wars games. And that's when I decided to leave Spectrum Holobyte and join LucasArts.
And did you contact? What was that like? What was that process like? Did you reach out to them or?
Well, at the same time, one of the guys that I had started the console group with at Spectrum Holobyte, Dean Sharp.
Oh, I remember Dean. Yeah,
remember Dean?
Yeah.
So Dean, who is a legendary console game developer, he jumped over to LucasArts, and I also knew a couple of other people at LucasArts from some of my early days in the games industry. Some people I'd worked with, like John Knowles, I'd worked with. Coincidentally, actually, totally forgot this story, is when I was contracting after my first company, Synergistic Software, I went to work for Taito, which is a Japanese game company that started up a satellite office in the Seattle area. And so I went to work for Taito, where I met John Knowles.
Oh.
And John and I were working together, and it was on an Indiana Jones game. It was Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. This is long. This is like a decade before.
Yeah.
I don't know if a decade, but it was many, many years before LucasArts or anything like that. So Dean had gone to LucasArts. I knew John already. I knew another guy. His name was Toshi Morita, who was also over there at LucasArts. And so basically, I'm playing this X-Wing game and just loving it, and think this is what I want to do right now. And it turned out that I had a couple friends over there, and they were trying to get me to come over. So I came over and basically, went out to lunch at the ranch like everybody does, and enjoyed that, and came back, and I sat down. With the head of development at the time, and it wasn't really an interview. He just said, because people knew me there, so I didn't need to really interview. Like, they knew what they were getting, and so he just says, "What do you want to do?"
Wow,
you could do anything. And at the time, the only thing LucasArts had been doing had been the adventure games.
Yeah.
Plus internally they did the X-Wing and TIE Fighter games were going with Larry, but those were external projects. So internally within LucasArts, they were just doing a few console games around Star Wars and mostly adventure games. And he said, whatever you want to do. And I said, I want to make a Star Wars game. And he goes, okay, great. Come and do it. And that was how we started.
Wow. Was that Dodderman? Was that Steve Dodderman?
That was Steve Dodderman, yeah.
Yeah, I figured. Yeah, he's who actually was, I guess, the last stop on my interview tour when I interviewed at LucasArts as well. So,
yeah.
Interesting.
Wow.
I got to tell you, it's almost like I think back and what a dream it was, because they literally said, yeah, whatever you want to do. And they said, oh, by the way, you can put your team in this building here. And it was a building all to myself that had been vacated recently by the attractions group. So Lucasfilm had an attractions group, and where they did a lot of stuff around theme park attractions.
Mm-hmm.
And so they gave me this building that had all these, offices, cubicles, conference rooms. Nobody was there. But it was lavishly decorated with Star Wars props and matte paintings. And, I remember sitting on one of the cubicles, like clamped to one of the cubicles, was one of the guns that was a prop on the back of Jabba's
Pleasure
barge.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pleasure barge. There's like this stuff, and there were Ewok wings hanging from the ceiling over my desk. I mean, this stuff just littered around the office. It was an absolute museum that we were working in. And they said, "Yeah, this is your building. Hire a team and make a game."
And was this in Kerner then?
Yeah, down in Kerner complex. Yeah, down by LM. Oh yeah, and to make it even more exciting, my office had this big window, and across the kind of little alleyway was ILM. And this was back before they were doing digital effects. And I remember, like in my first couple months there, like they were crashing an airplane outside, like a scale model airplane with pyrotechnics and everything was like happening outside of my window. And that was when they were filming Alive. And they were filming the crash scene for that, and so I'd see all this. I mean, it was just,
that's surreal.
Mind blowing to me now. I think I don't know. I feel like I kind of took it for granted back then, but I look back now and it's such an awesome time.
Yeah. Amazing. So what were the steps that led to Dark Forces? Can you because you want to make a Star Wars game, and of course Doom had come out around that time, Wolfenstein.
It was.
Yeah. So what
it was so Wolfenstein. I had played. Well, let's see. I had worked on a game prior to Spectrum Holobyte called Baseball 2000. It was an early first-person shooter, and it actually was a multiplayer first-person shooter. And really, all it was these hallways, and you were like a spherical happy face, and there was other players, and they were those happy face spheres, and you would drive around and shoot in this 3D maze. And so I worked on that before with some buddies of mine up in Canada. We worked on this game, Baseball 2000, and so when I was at Spectrum, working on FalCon, I, of course, really just fell in love with Wolfenstein, Castle Wolfenstein, which was, and I'm kicking myself, right, because it was basically the same game that we've been doing before, just, instead of, silly happy faces, it was, it was Nazis, right? Yeah, Nazis and dogs, right?
Yeah.
Yep. And so he was really big into that. So when I joined, and as Steve said, whatever you want to do, and I said, well, I want to make a Star Wars version of Wolfenstein. Like I want to do a 3D, shooter, in that vein. Yeah. And I don't even know if first-person shooter was really a term in those days, but it was just basically like a Wolfenstein kind of game. Mm-hmm. And so then it turned out that while we're developing Dark Forces, and that's when Doom was being developed sort of in parallel with Dark Forces.
Okay. Yeah. So it was, because I don't have the years lined up exactly. And so Doom came out. Brett, do you remember? Did Doom come out first before Dark Forces, or?
Yeah,
it did.
Like 94?
94.
Yeah.
Okay.
And in fact, I know
that 95.
You guys had an engineering leg up because, and you told me this once, and maybe you can fill in the details. But Doom had released a demo to test multiplayer, and as I recall, it was a debug version, or it had symbols in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you remember this? Yeah. Go ahead and tell that story.
Yeah. So, I guess maybe to take it back to the beginning, the biggest challenge that we faced when making Dark Forces was building these 3D worlds. Of course, it was all the physics and math and rendering 3D worlds and stuff like that, but we didn't know how to build. Nobody knew how to build a 3D world, and so ultimately how to build it in a way that you could render it on the machines that were available at the time, and so we were working a lot on that, and I think the intuitive thing that we did was to start, get a 3D program. We used AutoCAD, at the time and start just building, objects, right, that you can run around and look at. So you build these objects, and then we try to render them, and it was very free form, and we're on a cutting edge. And at the time, the Doom Alpha came out, which they shared, and people could play test it and stuff like that. And yeah, they left. They left when you're building software. At least back in those days, you had this extra debugging information that would tell you what all the lines of code, like what the names of the functions and variables were. And that debugging information was usually stripped out when you launch something, and they let this go and let the debugging information in there. They forgot to strip it out. So once I realized that, I just pull it up inside of a debugger and could start to walk through all the code. And yeah, we learned a lot about how they did, a lot of their techniques and how they built the world. And I'd say the biggest learning that we had from their system was, and we adopted this too, is that rather than thinking of the world in the intuitive way of you have all this space and now I'm going to fill it with objects, they took the opposite approach and they said, let's just assume that the world is, like this infinite solid space. And then we're going to define the negative space. Like we're going to define all the holes in this, and where the holes overlap, if you imagine you're making like cubes, you're just hollowing out cubes, and wherever the cubes overlap is where there are doorways. And that turned out to be a much more efficient system to build in, because you didn't have to worry about building, the interior and exterior things, and you're just generally building interiors, right? And it also turned out to be much more efficient to render because it just really constrained the problem to, convex spaces, right?
Right.
Rather than having to worry about all kinds of different variations.
Yeah, you're
carving
it out, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And so, yeah, we definitely, we were in the midst of really struggling with, I think ultimately with performance. How do you render the environment fast enough? And we're in the middle of that right when they released their alpha, and we definitely took a little shortcut. I don't know if we would have figured that out on our own. I think we would have had to eventually, but we got that little leg up from them for sure.
So can you, if you remember, can you talk about some of the early kind of concepting for Dark Forces, like the ideation phase and sort of, you knew you wanted to make a Star Wars game and you knew you wanted it to be a first person game, but how did it go from there? There were some, I think it's confirmed maybe by you and others that maybe the game started with Luke Skywalker as the main character, and then so maybe talk about that some, and just how did you get to Kyle, and what were the early days of like figuring out the ideas behind the game?
Sure, yeah. I would say that I remember when we started, I really had one vision in my head that was driving everything we were doing. Is I wanted to walk around a Star Destroyer. I don't know why. It was like there was something about walking around a Star Destroyer, looking out through a piece of glass or whatever it is, and seeing a hangar bay full of TIE fighters, and seeing those TIE fighters launch.
Sure.
To me, it was, maybe it was just kind of thinking back to, episode 4 and when they got on the Death Star, and they're looking at those hangars. I think that really stuck with me, there's something about these hangars, and then you see the open space right beyond, and you're also in these control bays looking out over this, this scene was just so iconic and so original from when the original Star Wars movie came out, that was the scene I wanted to realize in Dark Forces. And that's where it all started. Like when we started building levels, and I remember I started building levels because we didn't have level designers, and nobody even knew how to make 3D worlds, at least nobody at LucasArts. And of course, there was no information out there how to do it. So I just started, picking up CAD programs and building stuff. And that's the first thing I did is I was like, okay, I'm building my hangar bay and, just going to step through it and figure out what it takes to build a hangar bay. And so that's really where the game started. And of course, if you're walking around in a hangar bay in Star Wars, you're walking around as Luke Skywalker. That was sort of a given, right? That somehow this game was going to be about Luke Skywalker and his experiences. But as it progressed, we ran into two very big problems with Luke Skywalker. One was that Luke Skywalker's story. We had to use the story that was given to us. We couldn't go build story for Luke Skywalker because that was George's job, right? He was making more movies and things like that about Luke Skywalker, and so or might someday. So he really owned that character. We couldn't just go write story for Luke. And the stories that fit for well for movies and the different action sequences and things that work in movies just don't work that great for games. So that was one big limitation. It was hard to imagine how you would make a game that could capture all the story of the Star Wars films, right, in first person and make that enjoyable and fun or even doable. And the other problem was there was just no way that we were going to be able to do lightsabers with the technology of that day. It was just too much going on. I mean, even if we could have figured out how to render a lightsaber, which we would not have been able to do, I can tell you that. Even if we could have been able to do that, the control, issues were, because we're dealing with a PC and a mouse and a keyboard, and figuring out how. I don't know if until recent, Wii style controllers and stuff like that. I think nobody's really has come up with a good control scheme until you got something you can actually hold in your hand and move in any direction, right? Which just didn't exist in those days. So those two factors, really convinced us that we were not going to do very well trying to use Luke Skywalker as our, or any Jedi for that matter, as our protagonist, and that's where, even Han Solo was off limits for the same reasons. Sure. We weren't in control of his story.
Yeah.
And so we needed a character that we could be in total control of and make a story for that would fit what we wanted to do with the game and not the other way around. So that's where Kyle Katarn came from.
And that's awesome. Yeah. I mean, I think, in retrospect, a lot of those reasons make a lot of sense. And that ended up being a bit of I don't know. I guess it's safe to say Kyle was probably the first one of these, but that ended up being the model for LucasArts for most of the Star Wars games, right? Where we were able to have more own. I mean, the Starfighter games, another good example. Rogue Squadron, mixed it up a little bit, but you played as some of the main characters, but they had their own as well, and so it was not necessarily a safer place, but it was just it was an area that we were able to have more ownership and, like you said, and kind of drive our own destiny because Lucas licensing and George and all that stuff.
I was going to say fewer approvals headaches.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So then, can you talk a little bit about the team that you did when they said, okay, you have a building and you needed to hire a team?
Need to fill it, yeah.
Yeah, what are some of the key folks that you brought in as you were starting to build things, to change the subject a little bit? Yeah,
of course, one of my first hires was Ray Gresko, who was his area of expertise was, if you could put it that way, it was such early days, but he was really focused on the 3D rendering side of things and had some experience in that realm. And so he joined the team and was responsible for developing our rendering engine. And then Justin Chin, who I believe, I remember correctly, I think Justin was maybe already at LucasArts at the time. And so this was someone that was basically, moving from one team to that team. And he joined as the lead artist on the project. And he not only led the art, but really took over the story and the characters and did a lot of the, I would say while his official role was lead artist, his actual role, I would say, was lead designer.
Mm-hmm.
And coming up with, he named Kyle, he came up with, what his personality was like. He drove the creation of Dark Troopers and, just generally, I think one of the things that I'm really proud of about Dark Forces is how it was a first-person shooter, but had a story.
Sure.
Which now is just very common, right? But back in those days, that was, Doom didn't have a story, right? Or anything that progressed through the game. Nor did a lot of games at that time, unless they were specifically story games. But we were LucasArts, right? And so story and characters are important. So he really drove, melding story and character into the first-person shooter. So Justin was another big, key hire, and we, and then we also had. It was interesting because we got assigned level designers from LucasArts, and the level designers that we had, that LucasArts had been doing 2D environments. And so the process of making an environment tended to be, for console games where it was a 2D, either side-scroller or top-down, shooter type game, where the process was, laying down blocks, right? And so you lay down blocks to make interesting mazes in 2D, the skill set required, I wouldn't say a skill set, just that the design skills in terms of making spaces that are fun to play in, that translated pretty well. But then you needed to do it in 3D, build 3D worlds. And so that was a big, big challenge. And so we ended up hiring a couple of guys a couple of students out of UC Berkeley who were in the architecture program there. And they were working to be architects, but they were also big gamers. And I went to them and said, "Hey, how about joining LucasArts and making a game?" And they're like, "Hell yeah!" So they came on board, and were a big boost because they got how to make 3D environments. They didn't have the experience of the other level designers we had in terms of making gameplay environments. But what they did have is the building 3D, imagining and building 3D environments. And so by putting those two skill sets together, we ended up with just a dynamite level building team.
Yeah, that's something. What we usually do at our final episode of the series, before we do the interview, is we talk about key takeaways and pillars, whether it was intentional pillars or not. And one of the main ones we talked about was definitely level design and sense of place. Of place and fully realizing
is starting from the hangar like that. I totally recognize and that totally makes sense to me, because that was one of the things we talked about a lot. It's like this feels so Star Warsy in a way that you wouldn't expect shooters of the time necessarily to do. Right? I mean, Doom is much more abstract, and Wolfenstein is a little bit more simplistic even. So I mean, it's basically just buildings. So yeah, it's cool.
They brought a sense of place and a physicality to it. I mean, when we would build spaces, they wouldn't just simply, make a big giant room without thinking, well, how does this room hold itself up? What's the support structures? And there's subtle things that were important to them as architects, right? But to the user, I think while I doubt anybody noticed that there was thought put into how this would have, because in the computer, anything holds itself up. You don't need engineering, in the traditional sense, to figure out how a room is going to support itself or a building. But the fact that those cues were there, I think, really, drove that sense of this is a real place, and that ultimately that suspension of disbelief.
Yeah, that production design was important to just the Star Wars films as well. Not only were, the early films primarily sets anyway, full sets, but it always felt like they had a sense of, albeit obviously they're just, theater sets, essentially film sets, but they looked like they would have been utilitarian in nature and worked the way that they should work. And yeah, I mean, that's like Nar Shaddaa and some of those levels just really hold up still today. I mean, I haven't played the game in so long, and you just come into some of those spaces, and it just one of the other takeaways that and Brett touched on it there that we talked a lot about is really fully realizing Star Wars in a game space. And can you talk a little bit about, if you remember, sort of some of the ideation around the different levels, and maybe it was just simply fantasy fulfillment, which I would totally understand, because each level basically was you sort of like your, the best of Star Wars, tour through Star Wars, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
like a travel log. But can you talk about that at all? Do you remember any of those kind of those meetings or conversations or stories about like, we should go to a sewer, we should go to this, we should go to that?
I think, a lot of it was, you guys too, right, from your own experiences, that a lot of times you draw inspirations from either the movies or the extended universe, and you find these locations and think, okay, well that creates a new environment. What can we do with that in terms of gameplay?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a lot of it, right? And I think of it as like a palette, you're making this drawing and you have yellow to work with, right? And say, okay, what can I do with yellow, right? Or, and then you get blue, and what can you do with blue, And so I think that some of these settings are like that. They are palettes, they create a kind of constrained set of a palette of things to work with. You could be sewers, it could be a Star Destroyer, it could be a base on land, it could be a snow environment. There's a lot of different these things that you go and pick out, and then you just use it like building blocks. And so that was a lot of what we did.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it was very directed. The very first level, of course, was about getting stealing, getting the plans, stealing the plans,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that was, that base that we created was specifically built around that story. So it was really a combination, I would say, of specific places that drove our story, specific, areas of fantasy fulfillment. So that we, had moments where you would just have this sense that I'm in a scene that I've seen in Star Wars before. And then other ones were like, hey, we just think that would be a cool environment to play in.
Right. And then Brett's probably going to link it in the show notes afterwards. He found an interview. It's called Computer Chronicles.
You were the hero of Computer Chronicles in one episode in 1995, I guess.
Yeah, 95 it says. Yeah, and it potentially one of your sons commented on the YouTube video, by the way. So just so you know, I don't know if you know that he found it, but the quote is, "He is my dad." Is the so I don't know if it's Justin or not.
Yeah, it's probably Justin.
Listening in. Anyway, the reason I bring that interview up, which I watched right before we started recording, is you talk about that this isn't just a game about shooting things. It's also puzzles and story.
Mm-hmm.
And you touched on story earlier, but can you talk a little bit about that goal that you guys had and how that came up, especially on the puzzle side? Because not only do the levels have such a great sense of place, but they have they're very intricate, and there's levels that have puzzles within them, but also the level itself is almost a puzzle. So yeah, can you touch a little bit on that? Because that was definitely a unique kind of innovation for this time for sure. And then I think I think it's safe to say that it also influenced a lot of shooters after the fact. So yeah, what are some thoughts on that?
I mean, a couple of thoughts. First of all, it goes back to George, because when George started LucasArts, this is legend, I wasn't there, but this is my understanding, is he gave the mandate to LucasArts that LucasArts was not there to simply commercially exploit his Star Wars stories, right? That LucasArts existed to create new IP, new characters, new stories, and to entertain in its own right in this new medium. And so I think from that developed a strong culture within LucasArts that, story and character matter. And then if you think of, where that went, right, is into these graphic adventures, Day of the Tentacle, Monkey Island, these early, very engaging stories that, were ultimately puzzle based, right? And so you had this culture of story, character, richness, and puzzle making and puzzle solving was just in the DNA of LucasArts. And so even though we were stepping a little outside of George's mandate, and making a Star Wars game, I think that DNA around story, character, puzzle solving, was alive, was very, very much alive and well within LucasArts. And so that's, that really seeped into the game, and that's, I think the best way I can put it is that it's, I'd love to say, that it was all my idea, and to revolutionize the genre in that way, right? But it really was a matter of the people on the team and the DNA of the culture of the company that just made it happen.
That's great. Yeah, that's a good. We didn't put two and two together on that one, but it really was a LucasArts cultural kind of value, if you will, or aesthetic. That makes a lot of sense in the era. When you're around all of the adventure games there with everyone else making those, and how do you infuse that into a different genre? So that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool to hear. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we actually, I think George would say we definitely pushed it too far with Dark Forces.
Oh, what do you mean? You mean as far as the taking advantage of the license, or what do you?
Well, in terms of being more, I think he definitely did not appreciate the violence of Dark Forces.
Okay.
The fact that we're shooting people. I think I remember I was showing the game to him for the first time. Really, I was demoing the game, and we were. It was, I think it was the very first level, and we're shooting the Imperial officers and stormtroopers. Of course, you got stormtroopers and Imperial officers. And something that just never even occurred to me until that moment is he was, his first thing was like, why are you shooting, you should be, we made stormtroopers so it didn't feel like you were shooting humans.
Yeah.
Right? So they didn't feel like people. And so that made it, better, kind of from a moral standpoint. And, so he did not like it all that we were shooting Imperial officers, which I never had, I just never put that together in my own mind. But you think back and you go back and watch Star Wars, it's all stormtroopers and robots and aliens, that are getting shot up, not people in general. And so, so I think what, in retrospect, I think if I could have done that video or that demo for George over again, I would have talked a lot more about the characters we developed and the storylines that we made and the puzzles that you were solving, some of the more mentally challenging aspects of the game than just simply shooting everything you can.
Right. Well, you in the Computer Chronicles interview, you make a big point about that. So you'll have to watch that.
I don't know if I remember that.
No, I'm sure you don't. It's a young, hilarious Daron doing this. So I mean,
oh my God,
what are some? Are there any memorable moments or kind of takeaways for you? Obviously, as we play the game, we have some that emerge as we play, but like, what are some lessons learned or things that really stick in your mind for Dark Forces specifically, for your career, but also for being there at LucasArts, or just the way the game turned out? It was a huge success for the company and for the team and for you. And and I said in the first episode myself, which I probably told you this story, but you've forgotten. It was really the game that got me into the industry, to be honest. It was, so that story you told about sitting in that cockpit playing X-Wing, which kind of drove you to go seek out LucasArts. That's what I did in my closet with Dark Forces, literally where my computer was when I was living in San Francisco in my one bedroom apartment with my now wife. And so what? Right on. No, dude, and getting to work with you was a complete pleasure. So, but anyway, what were some things that come into your mind for Dark Forces in your past?
I think that the lessons that I learned, lesson I learned personally was, diving in, having no idea how you're going to do what you want to do, but just diving in with passion to do it and have a vision. I think having that vision of standing on that, standing in the control room of a deck of a Star Destroyer, that to me was just super important, having that visual. So that was key. And the fact that it worked out was, was really good, right? And then some other things that come to mind are, it's really fun to work on problems that no one's solved before, and reaching outside of your domain to figure out how to solve problems. And I think of that especially in terms of finding the right combination of people with different skill sets and putting them together. Reaching out to the architecture program at UC Berkeley, I think was key. And that was really me trying to just didn't know how to solve a problem. So started to think about, well, how do I find people that know how to solve this problem? Or maybe don't know how to solve, they haven't solved the problem, but they have a little piece of it. And if we can take a bunch of people with pieces, assemble them together in this really awesome space, this museum full of Star Wars props for inspiration, and put everybody together, that together, we'll make something great. And that's what happened.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. I mean, this was sort of the era of games that Brett and I have been tending to play are kind of around this era. Quite a few of them have been, and we do talk a lot about. It wasn't really starting quite yet with this when Dark Forces came out, but the teams in the industry were starting to grow, and they were, they weren't the handful of people in a garage or what have you, and some of the stuff that sounds like you were doing earlier on. When you first started, they were starting to become real teams and needed project direction and project management. And I guess you'd never told me that FalCon story, but it kind of made a lot of sense to me, because that's kind of what your career was very much about too, was leading teams and getting people together to do one really hard thing with a bunch of disparate people. So that's a good final takeaway.
I think that, one of the things, you guys are still in the games business, so tell me if I'm wrong here, but to me it was a real period of alchemy. Like we were doing so many new things and nobody knew how to do it. There was no pattern, right? You didn't have the roles that we have now. There was no such thing as a level designer or a 3D engine, 3D engineer versus an AI engineer versus a physics engineer or whatever, right? There was none of those defined roles. And so it was a lot of alchemy. Like nobody knew how to do it, and you just had to put people together and see what you got out of it. Yeah.
No, it's true. It's totally true. That's been really one of the fun things about the podcast is we're reliving these eras, and then in quite a few cases we've been able to talk to the people who were going through what you went through as well, and trying to figure it out as they went. And we played a lot of different genres, so it's had different problems and different constraints and different challenges. So it's been fun, but. Yeah, this was a Dark Forces was a good example of sort of the 3D side of the industry and where things were going. So awesome. Good. Anything for you, Brett? We're coming up on an hour here.
I want to thank you for coming, Daron. I also want to come full circle on the car question. and have you tell our listeners what car Dark Forces bought. We'll step up from a Vega, as I recall.
I wasn't sure if it would come up or not.
Oh, you laid that trap for me well, Brett.
Yep.
You asked about that first car on purpose, didn't you?
He lays he's crafty.
Yeah. Well, okay, so actually the car that Dark Forces bought for me is related to the car in a funny way. So related to the car that my first game bought for me, so that Chevy Vega. So when I was making that first game, my friend and I, Rick, built it and launched it, and we got written up in the local newspaper, local kids do good kind of thing, and talking about how we made this game. I mean, this is kind of insane because back then people didn't even hardly know, there was no such thing as personal computer video games very much, right? It was all, people knew what an arcade game was. And so here we were, a small town near Seattle, writing games. And so the local newspaper picked it up, and I don't know, sometime like a week later, we get this call from a guy named Doug Smith. He said to us, he says, "Hey, I'm making a game. I live not very far from you guys. Can you come look at it? And, let me know what you think, and, tell me how I can, what I can do with it. How do I get it published?" And so we were like, sure. So we went over to his house, and he was at University of Washington. We were in high school at the time. And he was making this game called Lode Runner.
I knew where it was going.
And we were like, we have no idea what to do with this, but can we just play? Like, we just want to come over time. It was such a fun game. Like, we had nothing to offer him other than, can we just play? Can we play and play and play? And we'll be your play testers, because we just had a lot of fun with it. And it was a really cool game because it was kind of a side scroller type game, puzzle game. But what made that game so revolutionary is it came with a level designer, level builder, right? So you could make your own. And it was probably one of the very first games ever made, if not the first, where user created content was, what really drove it. So anyway, no thanks to us, he ended up with Broderbund, one of the early big publishers, and that game went absolutely bonkers. And he invited us over after it had launched, kind of some number of months after it launched, and he was like, he's like, yeah, check this out. And he takes us to it. He's at his parents' house. He's living in his parents' house, and we go into his garage, and sitting in his garage is a brand new Porsche 911. And I just thought that was so freaking amazing. And so, now then, I don't know how many, that was probably in 1983, right? So 10, 12 years later, I make Dark Forces, which was not necessarily my first big success, but the way LucasArts was set up, the leads of the team participated in the profits of the game, right? Basically got some royalties. And so those royalties started coming in, and the first thing I did is went out and bought myself a 911, Porsche 911. It was just like, I don't know, it was like, for me, it was just like a symbol. I did it, it was like, and something I'd always dreamed about and finally got.
That's awesome.
So Dark Forces bought my first car, and not my second car, but the most, let's just say, it was a pretty cool car.
I remember it well. It was.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Darren. That's awesome.
Good story.
Yeah.
Good story. Lode Runner. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. You want to close us down, Brett, or
yeah,
are you good to go?
Yeah, no, we really appreciate having you on. It's great to catch up and great to hear about Dark Forces so much, and to maybe spring a little trap. welcome back from the break. Quite an interview. There's a few stories that neither one of us have heard, and that's kind of amazing considering how long we've both known Daron.
Yeah, it was really, really cool. Especially, I mean, I don't know why it never had come up, but I at least had never heard a lot of the early stories, about his career and how he got into it, and the the trap you laid for him.
Yes.
Inadvertently, directed us toward a pretty cool story.
I had no idea about that. I didn't know he knew Doug Smith. I mean, I should have put it together because I knew he grew up in the Seattle area, and the computer game programming scene was not huge in the 80s. So I should have been able to put that together. And R.I.P. Doug Smith. He died a couple of years ago now, I think.
That's right. Yeah. I remember that.
I think he was in like Olympia or something still. So he had lived basically his whole life out there. But amazing story. That I don't think people who are sort of more recently come to games are probably super well acquainted with Lode Runner, but it was legitimately one of the seminal games that really, not everybody played Lode Runner, but everybody who did and used the editor became a game designer. It's like they say about the Velvet Underground or whatever. Clint Hawking has talked before about how formative that was for him, and stuff like that.
Yeah, a legendary game. Yeah,
absolutely. And it still holds up. Honestly, it's quick paced. And
totally.
It's a great game. So if you haven't played it, go find a virtual Apple online somewhere. I'll put one in the show notes. Make sure to put your caps lock on because you have to use capital I, J, K, and L, I think, to move around in that game. Good luck. Great game.
Yeah, and his answer to kind of puzzles and story and why they were pushing in the direction they were with the shooter was good too. I don't know why we didn't put that together, but really it was such a part of the DNA of LucasArts. It makes a lot of sense now. And so that was there's a good insight. He had inadvertently kind of gotten onto the hiring architect from UC Berkeley story without me having to ask, which was kind of nice too. Yeah, that was definitely an obvious thing too. Yeah,
and a big deal. Yeah, no, it was a terrific conversation. It's amazing. It is amazing to me that we're still learning new things from Daron. Because he was my first boss in the games industry, really at all. Really, my first boss ever. Good point. At a real job. So
good point.
He is my game development dad for sure.
Yeah,
and that's. I learned so much working with Daron for especially the Starfighter games because I worked directly with him every day. But even later, as he became an EP, so. It's always fun to catch up with him, and I wish he lived closer, or I lived closer, so that I could see him more often. Because he's terrific to talk to. All right, well, when you're listening to this, I just want to let you know to keep an ear out on Friday. We're going to have a little bonus episode. We had one of Daron's sons wanted to interview us, and since we never get a chance to do that on the show, it seemed like a fun thing. We're going to put it out as a little bonus episode. It's a little 20-minute or so thing on Friday, and you can hear us talk Republic Commando, which is something we occasionally drop in, but nobody's ever asking us questions and sort of directing that. So it was kind of fun to have that experience to turn the mic around, as you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it was nice to have Daron there at the same time too.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
kind of a nice and Justin's definitely a fan, so that's fun.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Okay, so this week we've got one email and no reviews. I want to at least point people at the review where you can put the reviews. We'd love to have them through the Apple Podcast app. That's the best way to help us reach new listeners. And of course, you can send us email at devgameclub@gmail.com, which Dan Hunter our man in Guernsey, did this week. He says, "Hi, guys. Thank you for revisiting Dark Forces on your podcast. When it comes to early first-person shooters, id's Doom and 3D Realms' Duke Nukem often get all the kudos, so it's nice to take a reflective look at another FPS title of the same era. I played Dark Forces on first release back in 1995, and back in the day, I devoured various Doom mods, such as Aliens Total Conversion, a few Star Trek mods, as well as a Star Wars conversion. But here was the LucasArts real deal, with laser blasts you could see and purposely recorded dialogue from the game, rather than movie samples featured in most total conversions. I now realize that I didn't truly appreciate what a progressive step Dark Forces was until returning to the game some 20 plus years later. Apart from the obvious up-down viewpoint, the level design and architecture is outstanding for its time. Each mission provides a working Imperial environment. I was really impressed by the moving entities, whether they be part of a generator or drilling machine or etc. They really give each play area a proper logic and visually tell a narrative in the Star Wars universe, unlike the arenas of Hell in id's masterpiece. I know Hell doesn't need logic, but I feel it helps sell the experience. There are issues in that the interface needs some work, fancy pressing escape to finish the level. I'm so used to mouse look that having to press keys to look up and down feels a wee bit clunky, but overall I enjoyed my recent playthrough more than the first time I stuck the CD-ROM into my dad's 486. So thank you for inspiring me to pick up and play this classic. Another often ignored FPS of this period is Bethesda's Terminator Future Shock, 1995, game featuring proper 3D as opposed to 2.5D sprite-based games and awesome, he puts in quotes, full motion video. Did you ever play this game? So we'll get to that. Anyways, I can't leave without another question. Tim has worked on the Halo franchise, which was for a time an Xbox exclusive. As developers, how do you feel when you are working on exclusives? Is it easier as you've only got one platform to concentrate on? More stressful as the pressure of working on a game that sells the console? Gutted that your work may not reach as wide an audience as a non-exclusive title might? Do you think exclusives are still relevant as they were during the first generation of Xbox and PlayStation consoles? Keep up the good work. Looking forward to what you play next. Cheers, Dan Hunter. So, did you ever play Future Shock?
Yes. I did.
I did not. So you'll have to represent on that one.
It was revolutionary. I do remember that. I do also recall it was buggy as hell. So it was actually, it was hard. I was hesitating in saying that because I knew what you would say, but yeah, it was hard to finish. I'm not even sure if I completely finished it, but I did put quite a bit of time into it. And I do definitely remember it being revolutionary. As an aside plug, Danny O'Dwyer does, he left GameSpot quite a while ago, and he has a documentary series called No Clip that he does. And he just did a Bethesda retrospective, interviewing sort of everybody and kind of, I think, I haven't watched it yet, but I saw the breakdown and have set it aside to watch with Todd and everybody. And they talk about the Terminator game and how it was kind of the genesis of things for them in certain ways. So anyway, a little plug there. I'm going to watch it later, but
I have watched at least that much of it. I got up through Morrowind and will be returning to it myself, but I'll definitely put a link in the show notes.
Cool.
So people can check it out. And I think by the time this actually comes out, there will actually be a second episode, which is about the development of Bethesda's new thing. So,
oh, cool. Right on.
So if that comes out in time, I'll put that in as well. But otherwise, you can just look for it on that channel. As far as exclusives go, it's tricky as a programmer. I mean, I think programming probably benefits the most from exclusivity in some ways, because only having to target one hardware is really, really nice. I think that's less of an issue these days. I mean, there are still homegrown custom engines. It's less likely to be something that I do in my own work going forward. So it's kind of not necessarily going to be a huge deal for me to even think about it. For example, Unity, which I'm using currently, just does all that stuff behind the scenes for you and targets the platform. You always have to do some special stuff. You have to support trophies versus achievements versus whatever. But there's always some sort of platform particulars that differ. But the actual work of making it run on that target is mostly done for you. So that has kind of smoothed out, and the hardware is a lot less different than it used to be, at least between PC, Xbox, and PlayStation. The Switch is another beast entirely, but that does tend to be true. And of course, I'm thinking of those machines in particular. If you add in things like phones and iPads and the Switch, then the variety is often a lot bigger. But yeah, I mean, I've never really worked on something I would have called truly exclusive to a platform. Even Starfighter, we developed on PC and ran on PC all the time. So for me, it was always in part a PC title. Even if it hadn't come out on it ended up coming out on PC. But if it hadn't, I still would have thought of it as a PC title, because that's mostly how I played it early in development, especially. So it's hard for me to say. You, sir, have probably more of a fix on this one.
Yeah, and I'm as I've said in the podcast before, I always want to be a little delicate with how I talk about things I'm actually still, involved with and such. But I mean, he had a few different questions in there. For me, I actually came to Microsoft in a 343 to work on Halo, because it's definitely near and dear to my heart, but also I wanted to know what it was like to work at a first party studio, to be honest. I wanted to see what the differences were, and I had done it before, and so I just kind of wanted that experience. And he's correct that the thing is there's always the pressure. It's just a different kind of pressure, I think, for the exclusivity of it. And of course, Halo is, Chief is sort of the Mario for Xbox in a lot of ways. And so the pressure of selling consoles or selling service or things like that are definitely there and definitely felt. The other reason that I wanted to do that, though, too, from a designer's perspective, is I actually do appreciate having one system to focus on quite a bit. It doesn't necessarily always make the most monetary sense, and of course, almost every other publisher doesn't have to worry about that. But the amount of focus that you get is pretty cool, and it allows you, to kind of customize things differently, and much more what your constraints are, and what your advantages are. And I actually to really plug the competition a little bit, I feel like Sony's doing a great job of that right now with how they're handling their exclusives and how they're focusing their engines around the tech and really allowing, like Brett says, it's not as big a difference these days. So it maybe isn't what it used to be in, say, the PS1 and 2 era, but
or the PS3, man.
Or the PS3, right? Exactly. Yeah, you have to include that one too. But I still think they have a role to play. It's definitely much more diminished than it used to be, though. It used to be a really big part of the business model of things.
Right. But it is still Nintendo's model.
It is, yeah, and they
almost entirely, right?
Yeah, they definitely can continue to succeed in that, and they really focus on the software hardware combination. But the thing is they lag in other ways behind where I think the industry's going, and that's okay. They don't have to. They can still focus and succeed quite well. But it's not really as much about the focus on the hardware, right. And so the hardware is more of a means to an end these days than really just the end, I would say. So. It's an interesting part of the industry over the years on how exclusivity has changed and evolved and such. It is.
It is a totally different sort of thing. I mean, there was a similarity in film as color was adopted, where you had different formats. So there have been some somewhat similar antecedents in the past, but it is. I'm hard pressed to think of any other creative industry that has had sort of a similar thing. I mean, you also had with home video VHS versus beta, but I mean that wasn't really a thing, right? There were no exclusives or whatever.
Usually one wins,
right? Exactly.
in each era, Blu-ray versus
right, or Technicolor
HD DVD. Yeah. I mean, I think the big difference though is the barrier of entry, right? Like for film, yeah, you had Dolby, and then you had Sony's thing. They're different sort of. You could choose to go to a different theater based on what technology they were using, but the barrier of entry is $10 to $15 rather than another console.
Yeah, for sure. And for filmmakers, I mean, in most cases, they're renting that equipment anyway, so they're not plunking down on a camera that they're going to then have to make 10 movies with because they're so expensive. They're paying for a camera when they need it, and so it there's a lot of things that don't translate real well from the analogy. It's the only thing I could think of though that's kind of similar. So it's a quirk of our industry with the competing hardware. Super interesting though. It definitely, it sort of gives you the thought that there might be a chance for somebody else to break in at some point, like that could just happen at any time. I mean, effectively that did happen with Microsoft. So, before that it had been Sony and Sega and Nintendo. And as Sega's fortunes fell, people wondered if there could ever be more than two. and then Microsoft is still here. Almost 20 years later, about 20 years later. It's been a while. Let's see, probably 17 years later. It came out in 2000, 2001, something like that. The original Xbox. I don't remember exactly, but something like that, I think. Anyway, thanks for the question, Dan, or the questions. And anybody else who'd like to write in, you can shoot us email, as I said, at devgameclub@gmail.com. Now, we'll have a little on-air production meeting here. Are we indeed going to have another guest next week?
What's that?
Are we going to have another guest next week?
Yeah, we are working on it. We are trying. I haven't confirmed. Let me look really quick and see.
I don't want to announce our next game.
No,
if we think we're going to have a
right. We're kind of between. We have two that we're kind of choosing between. And we got to figure out the best way to play them. But yeah, we shouldn't announce that. Let's see. Looks optimistic. I got a reply.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good.
So we're going to continue Dark Forces chatting. And focus on a different area, a critical area of the game. So until we lock them down, probably won't want to mention it. But
yeah, well, folks should look forward to that then. In the meantime, you can, of course, follow the podcast on Twitter at DevGameClub. Should our plans change, I'll definitely be putting it up there. And, of course, you can follow me at Brett_Duville and him at
Tim Longo Jr. with the JR at the end.
And thanks so much for listening this week. Enjoy playing games, and good night.
Good night.